All right, so it says we are live. We are at 2 minutes till, so for any of you who have tuned in early, we will begin today's broadcast promptly at 12 noon. So stay tuned. We will be starting shortly with today's topic of information protection in a borderless world. We have 1 minute. 1 minute now. So we'll count down. For anybody who's watching this on demand, if you go, you can obviously skip ahead because this is being recorded, and so the on-demand will be made available. I have about 30 seconds. Get myself a sip. I hope, Ilya, you have your coffee ready.
Got my water, yes.
There you go. All right, we are at 12 noon. So welcome to the Modern Security webinar series. This is video number 2 in our series. Today's topic is information protection in a borderless world. Just as a reminder, I'm your host, Michael Gannotti, and I will be monitoring the moderator Q&A panel. So that is located down below the video you're looking at right now. So if you look down there, you're able to post questions. I can respond to you during the presentation and queue those up for Ilya during that, and of course, tee those up for him at the end as well. So without further ado, we have a lot to cover today. So I'd like to welcome you, Ilya, and would you like to introduce yourself to our audience and kick it off?
Thanks, Mike. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Ilya Beynenson. I'm a security specialist from the Microsoft team covering the healthcare and life sciences sector. And today, I think we're going to be covering a tremendously important topic as it relates to most organizations that we engage with day in and day out. And that topic, as Mike introduced, is information protection in a borderless world. I think the biggest challenge that we see so far with broad deployments and customer challenges and questions relates to how do you deal with this kind of new reality. It's a reality that it comes with cloud computing and mobile access. And today, hopefully, we'll see what Microsoft, as a solutions provider and technology company, offers to deal with these challenges. And I hope that you come away with better information and a good understanding of what capabilities exist and what strategies and approaches to take in dealing with this kind of quote-unquote borderless world. So with that, I'm going to take over as presenter here and start with the slides. As Mike mentioned, please go ahead and ask questions. We have moderators standing by, operators standing by to assist. And what we'll do is I'll talk through the information, but at any point, if you have any pertinent questions, we can certainly stop and address those. But we'll have a Q&A section at the end. So for folks that want to enjoy the presentation, we will wait until the Q&A for those that want to ask any supplemental questions. So what do we mean by information in a borderless world? I think for organizations, given the fact that we are now living in devices and user ecosystem and application ecosystem that no longer really conforms with what traditionally was the security perimeter of the past, which is we have a defined, delineated control over our border, and we have well understood policies and controls in place to protect not only the accounts, the identities of the users, but we have all the devices under management, we have a known state of applications that folks are using, and we have data protection under our control because it lives mostly within the security perimeter. However, as most organizations find or discover as they go through this transition, is that boundary control really is not effective anymore. What we're seeing more and more is customers asking us, we have all of these on-prem tools that we run and services that we run, but all the time our actual end users within the customer organizations are coming to us not only with challenges on using third-party applications, third-party solution providers in the cloud, but accessing and requesting access from devices that we don't really control. So your typical BYOD scenario, your login from anywhere kiosk. Those kind of challenges really pose a lot of complexity in terms of how to manage and secure your data estate. So this kind of sets the context for the various aspects of the solutions that we'll look at today. I think most organizations kind of understand that this is quite a big hurdle. It's kind of an evolutionary next step in terms of bridging the gap between what we used to do on-prem with a defined perimeter with now living in, as the title of this talk calls, a borderless reality. So in regards to this specific topic, what we're really looking for is protecting the data lifecycle of the file itself. And what we're going to take a look here at is the sensitivity of the particular file is really at the creation of the file. So we're going to talk through the entire A to Z, how a file or data is created and how it is either retired or wiped or through governance purposes kind of put the life cycle to an end. So we'll walk through several iterations here, and I think this sets the context into what we'll be looking at from a technology solutions point of view. So the first primary challenge is, do you even know, or does your organization or do your customers know what data exists within your organization? So when we're talking about sensitivity of data, you have to understand what that means contextually as an organization. So the primary challenge is to get a holistic understanding of what data exists in your environment. And as you can see here, data can exist on-prem, data can exist on the devices itself, and more we're seeing data persist across third-party ecosystems. So cloud applications, Google, Dropbox, Workday, Salesforce, just a number of places where data can end up, even if it was originated in the perimeter itself. So the solution or the next approach is, once you have discovered what data exists, the challenge then is to internally create a taxonomy that classifies and labels that data based on its sensitivity. Now, the sensitivity is something which we will go into in a few minutes in a subsequent slide. But really what that implies is you understand the differentiation of your data sets, and this is, we're talking about unstructured data here, so your files and all of the various repositories that they exist, and data classified based on the actual sensitivity of what's inside. So if you're talking about defending the crown jewels of your organization, your trade secrets, kind of proprietary information, that might have a different sensitivity context within your organization than, let's say, the cafeteria lunch menu, even though both documents may have originated in the same kind of organizational boundary. So the first thing is detection. The second in the life cycle of the file. The next thing is the taxonomy of classifying and labeling. And the third kind of pillar is protecting that data based on its sensitivity. Now I want to pause here and kind of stress that because you can apply protections to a file or protections to certain classifications doesn't mean that you should protect and restrict every single file type that you can discover and is classifiable in your environment. However, for those confidential or highly confidential or super top secret files, you certainly need a way to manage the protection of that file itself so that it actually persists and goes where the file goes in its entire life cycle. So as it travels across the various repositories, which you may or may not control, this particular sensitive file is going to carry and inherit all of those labels, classifications, and protections that you've put in place. As well as providing, you'll see some of our newer capabilities that were introduced recently provide full granular visibility into what's happening with that data. Who's accessing that data? Is it being shared inadvertently, or is it being shared overshared or are inappropriate controls layered on top of it. So you have all of that granular sensitivity or monitoring over that sensitive file, as well as dealing with retention policies, and especially as it relates to new GDPR regulations, privacy and compliance settings, which kind of wrap the end of the life cycle into retiring that file or terminating access to that file. So what do we talk about? We talked about a file specifically. Where Microsoft positions itself is the entire suite of our information protection solutions. As it regards to a particular file, it can exist within an Office ecosystem, it can exist in an offline or a SharePoint site, or a file share repository, or it can just be created and live on devices. So you have to have really comprehensive solutions that cover the entire ecosystem during the life cycle of the file. And here you can see we have various pillars that interact one with one another, based on the devices themselves, like where the data originates, based on the service that you're using. So here, Office 365 has built-in capabilities, and with that, obviously, we mean not only Exchange Online, but SharePoint and OneDrive through Office DLP. And then this is the critical piece, kind of where a lot of organizations don't even realize that this kind of gap in coverage exists and how to cover it, is when you traverse outside of that perimeter, outside that boundary, to your cloud services and third-party applications. How do you ensure that all that protection, labeling, classification, and rights management exists? So I think at this point we have some questions. I'll pause briefly to address any of those before we continue.
Yeah, so Ilya, we had 2 questions pop up. The first of which says, does Microsoft have tools or recommendations to help us find where all this data lives, is one. And the second was, are there taxonomy libraries by industry that you can purchase and import, or do you have to create from scratch?
Excellent questions, and I think that these are the exact type of things that you should think about as you're thinking about how to kind of protect your data estate. So the first question, we do have tools in various places in Azure Information Protection, as well as scanners or automatic discovery tools within Office 365 that allow you not only to interrogate the data that exists in the Office ecosystem and scan it for heuristically for information, as well as offline scanners through Azure Information Protection scanner tool that you can actually point to internal repositories, and based on the policies that you create, it will generate lists of the types of data that you have, any protection that applies to it, and it can actually automate those protection enhancements or enforcement. So it can actually label those documents which match your sensitivity needs, as well as layer protection on top of them. And the second question, do we have lists of taxonomies? Yes, and they're actually very, very comprehensive. I think we have over 80 sensitivity types of data, which basically are canned policies, and we'll go over a credit card policy here in a second of what that looks like. But essentially, it gives you out-of-the-box leverage without having to create your own taxonomy tools that allow you to instantiate a lot of these things out of the box, whether you're doing it through Office or whether you're doing it through the AIP ecosystem. And it's really important because what you want to be sure is you're not just doing basic keyword searching. You're not just doing kind of a very, very low-level discovery of the information. What we've built in and what we've developed over the years is a very rich and comprehensive system that does mathematical checks of checksums, does comparisons on proximity of words, does advanced regex operations, and most of these things, as they relate to the various industry-specific contexts, sensitivity types for financial, for health services, for HIPAA, for European data protection, all of those things come essentially default out of the box. Secondarily, you can also take those built-in policies and customize them to your own needs. So if you have advanced needs to discover certain types of data, you have the opportunity to take what we've provided out of the box in our services and modify them to your needs. So I think that addresses great questions. But I think some of this will be covered further along in more detail. So for those folks that ask the questions, stand by for a few minutes, and then you'll see a little bit more granular presentation of the capabilities. So just to recap, this what we're not talking about today is a siloed information protection point solution where on devices you do a certain thing, in Office you do another thing, and as it relates to cloud applications you do a third or fourth thing. It really is a holistic approach from Microsoft's point of view, and it covers the entire life cycle from creation to I don't want to call it the death of the file, but the retiring of the file, as well as what protections and options you have in collaborative scenarios where you want to actually securely exchange information with not only B2B partners, but maybe your actual end customers for your organization. And this tool set, as you know, the several products in there all holistically work together and talk to one another through policies and through our APIs to give you kind of a unified management ecosystem over your data policies. So as we continue here, again, this kind of highlights and emphasizes that our information protection solutions cover the entire life cycle, but they're also our holistic approach. It's not AIP is what you should be doing or RMS. It's all of the tool sets cover the various scenarios that you can leverage or that your organization can run into, and they all talk to one another and they can all interact. So as it relates to specifically what you do with the data, I mentioned before the individual life cycle of a file, but here in the broad pillared context, what you really want to look for is these categories. And the first, and this is I think the most challenging based on all the work that we do with customers, is the detection phase. So knowing what you don't know is kind of a scary proposition, and your organization has had files being generated, created, stored, shared, pushed around, deleted, copied, and pasted for years and years and years. And it can exist in different kinds of places, different types of online and offline directories, devices. And what you want to have is an approach that, first of all, detects where that data resides, and secondarily is able to heuristically understand, based on policies, what should be done intelligently with that data set. And that speaks to the second pillar, which is where is kind of the initial next step once you do your discovery, is classifying and labeling your data. So what do we mean by classification and labeling? Classification is understanding what your approach should be to determining the class of the data itself. This is not specifically to, okay, all company files that are originated in an organization are highly confidential because, you know, they're company files. Classification really means a carefully thought out approach based on some of that taxonomy that we discussed and some of the questions that were asked of the types of information that your organization engages in, whether it's internally or collaborates externally. And you have to define for yourself what rule sets you're going to apply in order to put a label on it. And the label is very important because the label actually persists with the file and travels where the file goes. And it's a label that, as we'll see in a little bit more detail, it exists in clear text and it's able to be read not only by our systems but by third-party DLP and other tools which can interrogate metadata of a file and attributes of a file. So first thing is detection, second is classification. The third is, once you have understood your data estate and you have thought through the various types of classifications that you want to apply toward that data, you then think about, okay, do certain classes of data need certain levels of protection? And protection here means two things. It means encryption of the document from a security point of view, and we do that through Azure RMS, or now the Azure RMS is the back end to Azure Information Protection as well as Office Message Encryption. And secondarily, assignments for capabilities for permissions. So you want to entitle users to be able to enumerate the rights of the documents as they not only work and collaborate internally, but they may want to collaborate externally. So that a certain classification of a file can have not only certain encryption and cryptographic protections layered on top, but it can also have permissions that are built into the document. So for instance, if your marketing organization is working on a new campaign and you, for some reason, you want to limit the exposure of that file without overprotecting it or without underprotecting it, you can actually specifically enumerate who has what rights organizationally or who has what rights externally to work with that document. And the fourth pillar, of course, is once you have all of those facets working on devices, on-prem and cloud, you want to be able to actually see and monitor what is happening with that data once it's been created, classified, and protected. And we have several tools available to do that. Here, this is more of a definitive enumerated list of where certain capabilities fall in those four pillars. You can see that we have a number of technologies that cover a number of different use cases that work in the different parts of this data lifecycle. So not only from detecting and classifying, but from protecting and monitoring. For instance, you'll see things like on the top left, the Cloud App Security pillar. That's our CASB solution, which is natively integrated into our classification and labeling policy engine and is able to see if a classified or protected or a labeled file exists in third-party applications such as Box and Dropbox. So you can actually, through the Cloud App Security portal, be able to see which users are publicly sharing a document which may have a classification label applied to it, which should have restricted access. And you can actually administratively take a look and take actions and excuse me, do governance over that kind of data. As well as Windows information protection. So natively, we have on our devices in Windows 10 the capability to separate personal and work data. And work data, which originates on your network, will be encrypted based on your policies and protections layered on top of that. Message encryption in Office leverages the same types of tools, so Azure RMS and those rights protections, and is natively built into the stack. Conditional access is a pillar that limits and enforces conditions before you actually even go to access that data based on a number of factors, as well as subsequent kind of information controls that you can have through AIP directly or through Office DLP. And of course, as with most Microsoft products, we expose API to partner applications and third-party vendors in order for them to natively integrate this capability into their particular application set or the services they provide. So this kind of gives the overall detailed architecture, but let's actually take a look at what it looks like when we go through these sets of pillars. So the first thing, again, we're going to take a look at detection. And which segues itself into classification. To reiterate the theme of this talk, what we're going to do is figure out, first of all, which data classifies it, or it should be classified at a certain level, and that's excuse me, that's based on what we call sensitive information, or the sensitivity types of files, and that exists on-prem and in the cloud. And let me just advance here. I'm going to pause here for a second because I think we have a question, and then I'll dive more deeply into what this sensitivity information type means.
Yeah, we actually had a couple of them. And so let's see. The first was, is this right? Yeah, can the permission on files sent to third parties prevent printing and forwarding? That was one. And the second was, do these different solutions require different licensing?
Great question. I'll address the first and defer the second. As it regards to the kinds of permissions that you can enumerate, yes, you can enforce rights that prevent forwarding, that prevent printing, that essentially put the document and restrict it to view-only mode. So when you're collaborating with third-party organizations or end customers, for instance, in a banking scenario, you're sending a secure bank statement, you want that to not be forwarded or printed, you can layer those restrictions, and those restrictions follow that document everywhere. And subsequently, you can actually take a look at what access has been done to that document, or what attempts to open that secure document through our kind of ecosystem of management tools. And you can revoke access to the document. So if it's being overshared, or if it's being abused, or if it's no longer relevant, you can actually revoke access to that. And how that works is that the policies and everything is tied into the Azure Information Protection, or RMS service, so that every time you as a user or your organization's customers access a file, it actually checks all of those permissionings, and before it issues you a key to open up that file and be able to work with it. So it actually smartly enumerates what permissions you have based on either the policy which was applied to that file or the user-defined permission set. But you have very granular capabilities in terms of the controls you have. Secondarily, the question as it relates to licensing is some of the advanced scenarios, as we discuss here, in terms of advanced automation and advanced governance, as well as advanced scanning and auto-applying of the labels, they fall under the premium SKUs of some of our products. And you can basically think of anything that you do from a manual or a user-generated context will be part of the product suite. And then obviously, as it covers Office DLP, it'll be part of Office. If you're entitled to Azure AIP, all of those tool sets, classification, labeling will be entitled to you. But when you're in the realm of maturity where you're ready to auto-classify in bulk your data estate and put automation and management from an advanced scenario, you can think of anything that starts with an A, auto, auto classification or advanced. That likely will involve a premium SKU, as well as some of our third-party SaaS kind of integrations where you have insight and context into what's happening outside of your ecosystem. Some of those features are also part of the premium SKU. But I encourage you to take a look at the guidance that enumerates kind of the specific licensing types that you have for all of these features. Generally speaking, most of this is you have out of the box when you're consuming those services. And what I mean is, if you're an Office 365 customer and you've already provisioned your workloads, you actually have access to a lot of this through your DLP functionality, as well as if you're doing basic classification through AIP, you certainly can do that. But again, anything with an A in front of it, I typically think of as advanced or auto would be a premium feature. So I hope that answers those questions. Here I'm going to pause for a second and go over what we mean by sensitive information types. When you're thinking about discovering data and you're thinking about classifying and labeling data, one of the most important things to understand is that what the system, through the classification engine or the detection engine or the DLP engine, is doing is not just simple searching for a keyword. We have, this is just an example of a credit card number, but you can see that the sensitive information type is based on functions that are called to check. For instance, here is the LUN checksum, where it validates the credit card number, make sure that it falls within the range of valid credit card numbers. It checks regex, or regular expressions, for advanced scenarios. It also does contextual detection of proximity of words. For instance, if you have here just a 16-digit number, but it's not accompanied by, let's say, an expiration date or the word Visa or MasterCard, that will actually have what we call a lower confidence level in terms of identifying this as a particular information type. In this link here in the slide deck, you can take a look at all of the various built-in information types that we have, but here I've put up kind of as an example of what the system looks for when it interrogates a file or interrogates repositories which contain files. So when you're thinking of, okay, well, this is great for new files that a user is working with, but what do I do with all the existing information that I have organizationally? This gives you context into what the scanning tools are going to do when you point them to your various repositories, and these are the types of things that they'll look for. So for instance, in Office, the DLP engine, when you go to send a document or attach a document through email, and you'll have a label or you have a policy which checks for this sensitivity type for credit card numbers, these are the things that it checks, and you can look at an enumerative exhaustive list of exactly. I just took snippets and added here kind of for visual purposes, but it's a much more delineated and defined list as it regards even credit card numbers. So it's important to understand that when we're talking about classifying documents by sensitivity level, this is what we're talking about. So the various sensitivity types. And again, I mentioned earlier, these are all exportable and customizable. So if you want something more robust that doesn't fit the criteria as an out-of-the-box policy, you can certainly export that and then modify it and import it as a custom policy. So once we have understanding of what types of classification sensitivity types we can look for, this system can actually take a number of actions on the file itself. We have here an example that an automatic classification can be set based on, for instance, if your organization has proprietary credit card transactions and that's your core business, you can apply that credit card sensitivity type into a policy that will automatically label anything that is defined by that policy without user interaction. We typically don't recommend starting with automation. You can run into scenarios where it either has a false positive or it classifies something at a high level and does not give the user a right to lower or delete that classification level. And automation really is for those kind of advanced scenarios where you already understand your data estate and you've already had the taxonomy discussion, you've had the business process and organizational process set up to kind of deal with how you're going to apply these labels, and then you can go ahead and think about classification. But our typical most used kind of initial onboarding and kind of your best lowest hanging fruit and your time to value is when you expose these labels to the actual end user and you train and work with those end users to understand what those classification labels mean. You'll see some of the default labels that come out of the box, and they have things like general, private, confidential, and highly confidential. However, a lot of users are confused as to when to use what type of label, and it really can get kind of over user heads very quickly unless you have an engagement with them to kind of say, these classifications are for these types of business scenarios, and here are the conditions under which you should classify, can lower the classification. Kind of the middle between the automation and the manual is the recommended classification, which is something that a lot of organizations do in terms of suggesting various classification levels to customers. So if you're working on a document and you're not sure what to do, your organization can set a policy to prompt the user visually with a bar that says, it looks like you're working with this type of data. We recommend that it's classified in this manner. And those are certainly things you can do. What we saw with one customer is that they had various companies that they've acquired over the years, large financial organization, and they had 3 labels that fit their needs globally and broadly. And it was very simple, and the reason for the simplicity is that they wanted the users really to have an intuitive feel and understanding of when you're working with a classification type, it should mean something specific to kind of the business case, meaning if you have 37 different various options for them to select, it's very unlikely they're going to adopt labeling files at the creation of the file. You want something intuitive, that's something that aligns with them, with the way that kind of the users interact with documents, and you want it not to be obtrusive. So it's the approach, simplicity here is kind of the recommended approach. And if there are no questions, I'm actually going to show what it looks like visually. When you have classification applied, this is within Word. You have here a Word document that has the AIP client, so the Azure Information Protection client, with its policies kind of built in. And the label here applied, you can see in the top left, there's a sensitivity tag, and it says this is internal, and actually shows that it was set automatically for a particular person. So you can actually define in policy that certain labels apply to certain individuals automatically based on the type of work they do. This is an example of an automatic classification. The other types of classifications that we typically see are what I just mentioned, the recommended classifications, which is where the system will interrogate based on the sensitivity types of the file what it thinks the label should be, and then it actually prompts the user through a notification or through a tooltip that you should apply this kind of label based on the document scanning that we've done. One of the things that is an option for your organizations is certainly that when you get into the realm of working with labeled and classified, or and by classified I don't mean the label classified, I mean the actual classification of the file itself, which could range from personal all the way to top secret or highly confidential. There are going to be instances where either the system flagged it inadvertently and it's a false positive, or the use case has changed for that type of document and you want to actually lower or change the sensitivity level or the classification level. And this is a way for the user here through reclassification to be able to do that as long as they're entitled to that right through the permissions of the policy. But it also actually audits that action, so that if you're looking for your logs or you're looking through kind of an admin view of what your users are doing, they have to provide it here as a pop-up for justification of why they're relabeling or reclassifying this file. If there are a certain set of documents which you want to restrict from being able to be reclassified, you actually can have a policy that does that. And so the user in that case will not have the option to lower the classification. And here is kind of what we see as the typical adoption scenario when you start thinking and dealing with policies that allow users to tag and label documents, is the user-driven classification. So here again in Word, we will have a ribbon that shows the various options that they can then select. And based on those options, you can see visually what it's actually going to do to the document. Not only that, you can see if you hover over the tool tips what the actual protections and rights are. So here you can see that there's a policy for finance only to be able to work with this based on the policy that was created for the organization. One of the other things that labeling does is it actually builds in watermarking, and it builds in footers and headers into the various documents. So you can see visually what the document is kind of labeled. So any questions before we move on in terms of the types of classification that you can do?
So this is Mike. We actually just had a statement somebody wrote on, and they said, love how Office documents are bubbling up classification with the document itself. And I just responded and said, I agree, use all the time at work.
Yeah, it's something that once you expose users to have that option, have that capability, you'll find, and then you communicate with them in terms of what the process and the business case is for labeling and classifying these documents, you find that users kind of self-generate the various sensitivity labels themselves, as long as it's not overly complicated. So the one thing that we suggest, and we see customers do well as suffer through growing pains of adoption, is if your classification set is overbroad or doesn't apply specifically to what the user intuitively thinks they should be doing with the document. For instance, you have 7 different sub-labels under confidential. Well, the user really is not going to know which document necessarily falls under that sub-context of confidential. So we, the keep it simple rule works really well in terms of prompting the user for actions, and we find that organizations that adopt this broadly typically limit the number of options that the users are exposed to, specifically to that ribbon in Office. So it's important to know what is it actually doing when you're clicking that button. So when you click one of those labels, whether or not it has protection built in, which is the wrapping of the encryption layer of the document, when you're classifying it, you're actually writing attributes into the file itself, and that's metadata that stays with the document. So if it's a Word file, you'll have attributes which any system can read because it's in clear text. So if you have a third-party DLP engine, you can actually base third-party DLP engine rules on the classification labels that you've designed organizationally, because they can read that. It's not in any sort of proprietary language. You don't need any special access. Everything really is in clear text as it relates to the metadata, and it follows the document. This is really important, because when your document egresses from your organizational boundary and ends up in a box or a Dropbox, you want to be able to scan those repositories that your organization owns and be able to see which documents, based on the labels that have persisted, are kept in maybe unsanctioned places, and put governance over that. Again, all of these labels, we have out-of-the-box labels and recommendations, but these are customizable, and my recommendation is to keep it simple. So here, as it relates to thinking about information protection across the various services and in your ecosystem, it's important to think that, yes, the file level protections and labeling exist with the file, but you also want to contextually think about the broader ecosystem that your organizational boundary in the cloud exists as, and which is to say it's very difficult to define that boundary. And here what you're looking at is options through our various tools and controls to kind of go up and down the stack, from the file level to access controls to DLP actions to revocation and tracking of documents across the entire life cycle of that file, across the ecosystem where that file exists. So it's important to kind of bridge from the actual specific document level over to the entire ecosystem of controls and governance that you have. One of the most used policy enforcements or policy tools is what we call here policy tips. So in all of the native Office applications and across our mobile ecosystem, so if you're doing the online experience through Outlook or Office 365 web app, you're going to see, based on the policies that you define, tips bubbled up to your users based on the actions that they're about to take. So for instance here, there's DLP policies that you can configure in Office that check for those sensitivity file types, whether or not the user has self-classified or has gone through the classification exercise. So if you're opening an email or you're working on a document and you go and try to send that off to someone else or upload it somewhere, you'll actually have policy tips that prompt the user and say, hey, you know, based on organizational definitions, it looks like this kind of content shouldn't be shared externally. And those things are very, very important when you're educating and working with your end users for adoption. So one of the things that you can do is put all of these controls in essentially a test mode with policy tips. So instead of actually enforcing and blocking access or restricting access, you'll surface these policy tooltips to your users as they're working with the documents, and you'll audit everything, but you'll actually allow those transactions to continue until such time as the users are able to understand kind of the context of what they should and shouldn't be doing in terms of working with those various types of documents. Another strategy that's important to remember is that you want to have the file itself have a kind of a level of assurance across our ecosystem of not only services but also devices. So protecting data at rest. So when it's on your file systems, you want to make sure that you're leveraging, whether it's through us or through third party, you want to make sure you have drive or device level encryption, you have the ability to manage and wipe remotely those devices, and obviously we have those capabilities built into our Windows 10 ecosystem through Windows Information Protection, as well as our Intune and EMS and MAM policies, which allow you to actually enforce restrictions at the device level, as well as when it traverses the boundaries and leaves that device, whether that's within your perimeter in the data center or into cloud services, which you may or may not have control over. You want to make sure that you're thinking of the sensitivity of the data and its data protection in the entirety of kind of where it can live, either passively on a drive physically somewhere, or rights and protections that are enumerated with the file itself. So once we have gone through the exercise of detecting, classifying, and protecting, we want to be able to confidently monitor and know what's happening with our data. So in conjunction with all the various tools to enforce these things or scan and apply these classification policies, as well as protection policies through AIP or RMS, you want to be able to have granular control over the visibility of what's happening to those files once they've been labeled and classified. Policy violations, oversharing, app usage. So for instance, where is this file being accessed from? Or is there any sort of anomalous activity that we're detecting? Maybe there's a file that's being accessed on behalf of a user. That user is being impersonated. So those kind of various controls and visibility you have across our products. You can have that natively in the Office Security Center. You can have that across our MCAS tools or our Cloud App Security Broker or CASB. You have various governance actions that you can take in those tool sets. And more importantly, for customers that have already invested into SIMs and log analytic kind of collection tools and insight tools, all of this is accessible via our APIs. So you can actually export, not only export logs, but query the underlying services through an API and get all of this information that you would otherwise have seen in a console or exposed through a report. You can actually import that directly into the various Splunk tools or various other tools that you use already organizationally, because every action that happens on that file, every action that happens with that user on the device, and all the access controls that you can layer on top of that, all of that is obviously logged and audited. So through the APIs, you can have granular insight into that. Again, I mentioned one of the things that you can have are various policy reports in the Security Center in Office 365. You can leverage, again, the Activity Management API, which specifically tracks all of this. As well as, and this is kind of more important to the user context, when you protect a document and you apply protections through native RMS or through AIP or through Office message encryption, if you apply, for instance, the do not forward policy on an email, what it does is it wraps the entire file not only in cryptographic protections, but it tracks what's happening in that file and allows you as the user to see who's accessing it, where, so geographic kind of distribution of where the access attempts are being made from, as well as once you take a look at that insight for that file, you can revoke access. So you can actually say, okay, well, this person is accessing it from a location where they shouldn't be accessing from, or this person has access which I've never entitled this particular user, and you can actually go and revoke access. So you have control over the entire life cycle of that file, whether it's left the building or not. So if the horse has already left the barn, you can kind of, this is one of the rare instances where you can force it back in, or I don't want to say, you know, for those PETA folks, I don't want to say what you can do with the horse, but you can gently nudge it back into the farm. So what is happening in terms of developing going forward? In our ecosystem, a lot of this has already happened. So for message encryption in Office, which leverages these capabilities for permissioning and protections, that's already available to customers. Again, Azure Information Protection has those 80 sensitivity types that we discussed. That scanner that allows you to target repositories and scan all of your known data sets, that's publicly available now, as well as integration with our Cloud App product to actually read those information labels once they've been applied. One of the things that is a big ask from our customers is, that's great if I have a Windows client on or Office client on a Windows device natively in you know, the kind of typical Microsoft ecosystem, but can I do a lot of these things in third-party platforms, on Macs, you know, on mobile devices in iOS? And the story is, we're working, or the product team is working on exposing all the native capabilities that you see today in Office applications natively to work seamlessly in those third-party configurations. So your Mac Office client will be able to tag and label and classify. Today the story is, on any device you can consume the content, but not every device currently is able to apply those protections and labels. There's a roadmap that we have that's publicly available that shows kind of where we're headed with the product. But the end goal state here is no matter where you're accessing this information from an organizational point of view, whether it's an iOS or Android device, whether you're using a web experience, whether you're using a native application, it should be intuitive for the user, it should be easy to use, and the protections should follow no matter the scenario. So that's really what we're looking for, as well as convergence. If you've ever taken a look at what Office 365 allows you to do in terms of DLP capabilities, as well as the AIP or Azure Information Protection component, where you can create policies and labels specifically entitling them with protections. There's a big convergence that's already been happening, as well as more work in that area where all of the systems will natively recognize the policies generated in other places. So you no longer have to worry about, okay, well, I have a DLP policy here that does one thing, and I have AIP policy somewhere else. Are they going to conflict? You know, which is going to take precedence? Am I going to have to manually export or import information back and forth? The teams are working very diligently on kind of the native experience, no matter where you are from a client point of view, as well as the administrative or operational experience of one policy or one set of rules and labels everywhere, no matter where you're touching the system, whether it's through Office directly or through AIP or Azure. So that's where kind of we're headed from a vision point of view. So we have about 10 minutes, I think, left in the broadcast. I wanted to make sure that I pause here and address any questions that may have come up. And again, this the hour timeline that we had doesn't do justice to a deep level dive to all the subcomponents, but should give you a good understanding of the types of things that you can do in terms of data governance, discovery, and protection across the ecosystem. So I'll pause here, catch a breath, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, let's take a look. I saw we had one actually. Oh, now we have a second one. And then we had a third. Okay, so the first is, does Microsoft have a way to track down you? And I think you already answered this, to track down users to open encrypted files outside of their organization? And I saw that was posted before you showed some of your slides around AIP, but if you can answer that.
Yeah, so all of this, all of the labeling and all of the protections that you apply are built in with tracking and revocation in mind. So if you're thinking of, once I apply these kind of tools to my data sets, what can both the user do as well as the administrator do to interrogate what's happening with that data, who's using that data, as well as where it exists. Third-party ecosystems obviously is a primary concern because you have users oftentimes for business purposes or inadvertently emailing documents off the reservation or off-prem to themselves or a third-party service, uploading documents to various file repositories in the cloud. And you want to make sure that no matter where that data goes, you have tracking and revocation that follows. And how that works on the back end is that once a document is tagged and protection layered on top of it, in order for you as a user to access that document, if you've been entitled to receive access, you actually have to communicate and talk with our backend service. And our backend service, first of all, checks the policy and makes sure that you're entitled to view that file, but also logs all those events. So if you're logging in from somewhere to access that document, and even if you've been entitled, but that access attempt is not in the scenario that was envisioned by the organization, you have option to take a look and view those events and take action based on them. So whether it's revoking access, whether it's files which have a certain classification but are being shared publicly, for instance, highly confidential data which your organization has tagged that now you've discovered on Dropbox, you can actually go ahead and tell Dropbox through an API to either quarantine that file or remove that file or apply protection on that file. So very, very robust controls into kind of the auditing as well as the governance you can take over that data. Was there another question?
Yes, there was. So the next one, let's take a look. It was, is internet access required for Azure Information Protection protected files?
The yes and no, and that's a very good question, because when you start to think how you access protection that's been governed by your organization, you first have to give assurance to our backend service that you are who you say you are, because based on the entitlement to receive that either email or that shared document that has those protections layered over it, you first have to prove to us or prove to the backend service that manages these things that you are who you say you are. And typically that comes in the form of authentication. Once you've proven who you are who you say you are, administratively, based on the sensitivity types or based on the policies or based on the actual user entitlements, so users can, when they generate permissions for that protection of that document, they can specify custom controls, one of which is kind of a lifetime of offline access. And by lifetime, I mean you can define it as you have to be online, or you can keep it offline for 7 days, or you can keep it offline and never check in indefinitely. And that's controlled by policy. So that's one of the things that the backend service checks to make sure that you continually have access to it. So for instance, if you've given permission to a file to some party and then you want to revoke that file, you, as part of that policy, would have put in place restrictions on how long that file can live offline. And once that has been triggered, the experience for the user is that if you've defined that I've gone over the time period where I'm allowed offline access, you have to re-authenticate again to make sure that you still have access to that file. So yes, in short.
Let's see, I believe for the last two we had just this has been great. Thank you. Thanks. Great session. Not seeing any other questions at this point.
All right. Well, given there are no questions, I've either done a terrible job or done a tremendous job. So
I think tremendous.
Yeah. So thank you, everyone, for joining us on this webcast. I hope we've been able to give you some insight at a high level as to kind of the scope of capabilities that exist as you're dealing with these type of modern challenges in data governance and managing your data estate. So thank you. I want to thank you very much for having me, and I'll hand it back over to Mike.
Yeah, and I guess the last thing is we have an additional, the third part in the series coming up on the 9th. Is it the 9th? May 9th, I believe.
Yes.
We'll post that out. So I'll go ahead and share that out on social media. But a recording has been made of this. We will be posting that up. So, I don't know if you wanted to share. I'm going to post it out on my LinkedIn information. So you can find me on LinkedIn at Mike Gannotti, Gannotti. And I'll share that out. And Ilya will be able to share that out as well. But look forward to that. Hopefully later this afternoon we'll have that video up and available. Any last words?
Thanks, everyone.
All right. So thank you all for joining. We will see you for part 3 coming up. And a reminder also, towards the end of the month, we have a Fire Away Friday session where you can join, ask all your questions about anything Office 365. And I'll also be covering, to open that up, kind of a synopsis of all the latest, greatest that's been happening in the service per customer request. So with that, this is Mike and Ilya bidding you have a great day and take care. And as always, ciao.